Hi, and welcome to another episode with Sage Holistic Health and Wellness Center. I'm Emily Sellis, your host, and I am so excited to bring to you today another episode. Today we have Renee, Lorch, and Andrea Lindquist, who are both specialists in working with individuals who are diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment. And today they're going to discuss how caring for loved ones calls for a tall order of self-care. Learn some tips on how to get through this challenging time of your life and educate yourself on what is actually happening with your loved one's cognitive decline. We hope you'll learn something from this. Reach out. You don't have to go through this unsupported. Have a listen.
SAGE is a 501c3 nonprofit organization building community by providing education and counseling about physical, mental, and spiritual well-being. We encourage all of our listeners to find their own path to what holistic wellness means to you. Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Renee Lorch. I am an associate marriage and family therapist here at SAGE. I specialize in working with older adults, specifically those affected by cognitive impairment. I brought with me today a fellow dementia professional, colleague, and dear friend to help share with you one of the most common themes that we hear in therapy.
Hello, my name is Andrea Lindquist. I am a licensed clinical social worker and a dementia specialist. I have a private practice here in Orange County where I work primarily with the elderly, those with dementia and their families. I provide consultation and therapy to individuals and families facing the issue of dementia. Renee and I have a shared passion for helping people navigate this challenging and lengthy journey sometimes. Thank you for having me here today.
Thank you for being here. While Andrea and I were brainstorming topics that we could talk about today, the topic of grief kept coming up. So we thought naturally that would be something we felt would be important to talk about today. So during our conversations, we both started sharing examples of how unique and complicated the grief cycle can be for individuals diagnosed with a cognitive impairment, especially for their caregivers. Well, we could talk all day about how grief impacts both the individual and the caregiver. For the sake of time, we're only going to focus on the grief process from the caregiver's perspective today. So we're going to break it down a little for you. So we're going to start by talking about dementia. When we hear the word dementia, Andrea, what exactly are we talking about?
So dementia, and this comes up frequently. People don't really understand. They hear the words used interchangeably: dementia, Alzheimer's, Lewy body. They hear about Parkinson's, as well as a slew of other diseases. But dementia is this umbrella term that's used to describe when someone's memory impairments are starting to impact their life. And the most common form of dementia that people hear a lot about is Alzheimer's, and that affects 50 to 70% of the people out there that have dementia. And those stats keep changing as we're learning more and more about the processes that are going on in the disease. But what we do know is there's a large percentage of people who have Alzheimer's.
Mm-hmm.
So for our purposes today as well, we'll kind of use Alzheimer's and dementia probably interchangeably, but just know that there is a whole slew of diseases. There's frontal temporal dementia, there's Lewy body dementia, there's Huntington's disease with dementia, Parkinson's dementia.
Vascular dementia.
Vascular dementia is another huge and very common one. And in fact, the Alzheimer's Association feels that at least 40% of the cases out there have more than one disease process going on at one time.
Wow.
So there is, it's a very vast field that we're talking about, but we're looking at people that are dealing with basically a memory impairment. So that's kind of where we're focusing our interest today as we talk about this subject.
Yeah, and Andrea and I both work with the individual as well as their caregiver. So when I use the word caregiver, a lot of people look at me like, what does caregiver mean? And so I thought maybe we'll just break it down and talk about what do we mean by caregiver. So Andrea, what is your definition of a caregiver?
So for me, a caregiver is anybody who's providing direct care that's kind of regular to an individual. So that can take the form of actual physical care. That can take the form of paying the bills for someone, helping them manage medication, helping them get to and from doctor's appointments. Maybe it's coordinating doctor appointments, a lot of the behind the scenes work that goes on. But many of our caregivers are also literally in the trenches of helping their loved one bathe, helping their loved one eat, managing them over a 24-hour period where a lot of times the individual with dementia is having sleep disruption. So the caregiver is experiencing that sleep disruption as well.
So true. Yeah.
We see that over and over again because so often the sleep disturbances can be a sign of, problems that are forming, especially with some of the Parkinson's type dementias. You get into the REM sleep disorders, but then you also see that very much with our traditional sundowning that we talk about. And sundowning can start in the evening, go all the way through the night, and it's just accentuated behavioral issues that happen throughout the day. We don't know why they happen, but the caregivers are left to deal with this, there's no clock that stops for them typically unless they are fortunate enough to have some respite somewhere along the line. And there's a huge, percentage of caregivers that are doing all of that day in, day out work. And again, as we mentioned in, the beginning, this can span for years and years. Sometimes it's a very fast progression, but a lot of times it's a very lengthy day in and day out over many years type of disease progress. So that's my definition of caregiving. And we see people who are children.
Yeah.
We see people who are spouses, nieces, nephews, grandchildren, sometimes even neighbors that are helping out. But I'd say predominantly in my practice, I see children that are caring for a parent and spouses that are caring for, their spouse. And a lot of times that spouse is also older. Dementia, your chances of getting dementia increase with age. Over the age of 85, up to 50% chance, of developing some type of dementia. So those spouses are also in their late 70s.
Yeah. And I know for me, some of the caregivers that I have, they come to me worried about their own cognitive functioning because they are, like you mentioned, they're not sleeping well. They have all of this added physical, emotional, all this planning, scheduling, all of these things kind of thrown on them. And then they start to worry about their own memory and thinking, worrying about if they're okay or should I get a diagnosis. So I know just the caregiving process alone creates so many emotional emotion. It just creates a lot of feelings and emotions and worries about their loved one as well as their own health. So, and I know this role, I've had so many caregivers talk about this like life role transition as they, I feel like wives in particular that have husbands who are they were in charge of the finances or in charge of the cars, and now they're doing their responsibilities on top of their husband's responsibilities, and they don't know how to do taxes or get their car serviced, and things like this just really add to their self-esteem. It adds to their stress, and these are the types of things we don't really think about when we're caring for somebody, and you just all these added responsibilities.
Right, and a lot of people in marriages, you kind of divide responsibilities,
right.
And suddenly that spouse that's not impaired is handling it all,
right?
Or children are trying to handle all of these, responsibilities for their parents, and they may feel like they're starting from ground zero. So it's a huge responsibility to take on, and a lot of times people don't get time to think about it. You're kind of propelled into this caregiver role, sometimes out of a crisis or sometimes out of just necessity. You don't get the ramping up slowly to taking all these things on. So they kind of hit the ground running,
right.
And then the marathon continues, and I always talk about this with my family members, my caregivers that I'm working with. It is typically a marathon journey.
I like how you
It's
say
not
that.
a sprint,
Right?
unfortunately. So as we had mentioned, we keep hearing this theme come up of grief. And Renee and I both share the same feeling, if I can speak for you, that grief within a dementia diagnosis and when you're dealing with dementia is unique because it has some unique characteristics to it. So let's talk a little bit maybe about what grief is for our listeners to kind of understand maybe the difference between grief and, what makes that normal versus more complicated. Would you like to share a little bit about the grief cycle? We've learned a lot from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross over the years, and there are other theorists out there, but she has some terms that people tend to be a little bit familiar with.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of the caregivers that I work with, or even the individuals diagnosed with cognitive impairment, when they come in, that's what they're familiar with, or they're talking about the stages of grief as denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and then obviously wanting to work towards acceptance. And I know for my experience, they talk about it as if it is this, they believe that they have to go through each cycle or there's a right way to grieve. I actually had a caregiver who told me their children were telling him that he was grieving wrong. And I thought that was very interesting feedback because there's really no right or wrong way to grieve. If, you're going through all the steps, you don't have to go through each and every one of them. There's no time that you're expected to go through the denial or anger, and sometimes we might get to acceptance and then we go right back to anger. So I think a lot of the, what we know about grief is true for the caregivers, but there's actually a lot more to the grief cycle that Andrea and I were talking about when we experienced with the caregivers, because there's just it's a lot more complex than just those 5 stages of grief. So, Andrea, what kind of things do you see in terms of grief during your sessions?
So a theme that within the grief with dementia that has been so prevalent is all of these losses that are kind of going on in tandem while the individual is anticipating the eventual death. So, people tend to think about grief in terms of just death, but there's grief with any type of loss or change to what is familiar.
Sure.
So when we have, say, a spouse that is no longer able to handle, say, the finances, and that's been their role in the family, or no longer able to cook the meals, that shift to what's familiar is a loss. And it's all of those losses kind of along the way that we encourage our, clients to acknowledge as losses to grieve as you move through the disease process. And, there's so much of, they talk a lot about this sort of dying of 2 deaths,
right?
Because you're grieving everything that you lose with the diagnosis of dementia, the person's ability to, think about, higher functioning. They may lose language. They may lose the ability to recognize people. They may lose the ability to, just function in all of their regular roles with their disease. And so there's all of those losses that occur before the person actually dies.
Yeah.
And it's just a very complicated subject, and it's grief and loss and death are difficult to talk about in the best of circumstances.
Right.
People don't know what to say to you when someone has died. So oftentimes they don't say anything, or they use these quaint phrases that don't always leave the grieving person feeling like anybody really understands, like, oh, you'll have time to get over it, or, well, at least you had them, so long, they lived such a long life, when you're really in the trenches of feeling the pain of that loss.
Mm-hmm.
And these losses start very early on with dementia.
Right.
So
I think even at like diagnosis, wouldn't you say?
oh yeah.
Because here we're looking at, I can't tell you how many times I've heard the golden years aren't what I expected them to be, or retirement isn't what I expected it to be. So you're essentially just grieving the loss of the future that you're never going to have. You planned this beautiful life with your spouse, and it's now changing for this, at this one diagnosis. And I feel like that it really just starts at diagnosis. Mm-hmm. And whether caregivers realize it or not, you start to grieve maybe the loss of your own self. I feel like a lot of the children go through this process where they're sandwiched between their children and their parents. So they're really fighting to find time for themselves and just always being, in caregiver mode or parent mode. Mm-hmm. And so kind of grieving over this freedom, or, I don't know. What about you, Andrea? What are your...
Well, and I talk a lot with my clients about the different hats that we wear.
Yeah.
And the caregiving hat can feel like the only hat that they're wearing when they're in the throes of caregiving, especially when you're caring, as Renee said, in the sandwich role where you're caring for your children as well as, and sometimes that's even adult children. Adult children are staying at home longer and longer.
That's true.
And their needs, or grandchildren.
Grandchildren, yeah.
I've had clients who are regularly responsible for the care of their grandchildren while they're trying to care for their spouse as well. Mm-hmm. So you get this multi-generational stress of dealing with this, but it is very important to try and hold on to the hat that we wear that is just our self hat, and how we see ourselves in other roles in our life as sister, father, child. Very often, my children who are caring for a parent, they feel like they lose the relationship of being the child to their parent. And instead now they're very much just in caregiver mode. They feel like they have to take on this sort of responsibility that a parent would take on with their own parent, which is a very conflicting feeling, and it's conflicting on both ends. But they lose that sense of, just having a mom or just having a dad, because now it's this caregiver role. And that's a tremendous amount of grief comes with that. And so often when we kind of point that out in our therapy work, there's such a recognition of, wow, that's what was really weighing me down. The fact that I didn't feel like I was my, parents' daughter anymore, that I didn't feel like I was the son anymore, because we've totally lost that connection, in that capacity, because it's so overwhelmed by caregivers. So we do a lot of work, or I do a lot of work with my clients to try and capture, moments, events, things that they can do to sort of rekindle that feeling of having, being the child, even an adult child, but being the child in that relationship.
Yeah, right. And even the resistance, I see that a lot too, when the parent says, you're not my boss, you're not the parent. And I think that plays in with a lot of that, makes the caregivers really throw their hands up. I don't know what to do. So that role reversal is really confusing. And so, you try to help the best you can, and then it's tough. So I feel like as the disease progresses, what happens I always explain it as we're essentially grieving the loss of a person who's still alive. And it's a really tough concept to understand, because you can look at this person that you love so much and realize, they're not the same as you once knew. And even though you really, really put all of your hope into just thinking, magic will come along and things will be back to normal. And So that I think that bargaining, that part of that cycle is definitely there, thinking, oh, if we just eat clean or exercise more, then I know that my husband or my mom will just be better. And so that's where that grief cycle comes, that hope, where you're constantly thinking, oh, maybe they'll get better, or the opposite, maybe they take a turn for the worse, and you're preparing for, the end, and then they bounce right back. It's kind of, I always explain it as feeling like you're at the edge of your seat, just you're not knowing what to expect, because today will look completely different than tomorrow. It's really unsettling. You don't know where to put your mind, so you're always feeling on edge. You maybe their words are better today than they were yesterday, so you have that little glimmer of hope that, oh, their mom is.
They've come back.
Sort of. Yeah. And when sundowning kicks in, their behavior really starts to exacerbate. So, we see different, maybe they can become more aggressive, or they just, all kinds of different changes. And so the way that caregivers have described it to me is sometimes they cycle through these stages of grief in a minute of hours or days or weeks. So I feel like this rapid cycling through the grief process is definitely one of those things that stick out to me about what makes it unique, the grief cycle unique for caregivers.
And that you raise a really good point, because there's so much of this idea with grief that we progress on this line, and then I'm all done.
Right.
And I've reached acceptance, and then I'm all done.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not really, it's more of a rotating through these stages. And again, there are many different theorists with different types of terminology that they use, but because people are so familiar with the 5 stages with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, we kind of keep referring back to that. There does tend to be this movement towards some degree of acceptance or reinvesting in your future. That is sort of a goal, but we sometimes reach that briefly or momentarily, and then we're right back into another one of the stages of disbelief. Mm-hmm. So, I really try and avoid people feeling like that's not normal, right? Because it is normal to cycle through things. And as you said, Renee, sometimes we're cycling through in a matter of an hour, as opposed to over the course of weeks, so it really, there's no right or wrong, as we touched upon, at the beginning, but it is helpful, I think, to see some movement in some direction, right? Because we can run the risk of getting stuck in one stage as well, and not having any progression. And so that's something that can make the grieving process more complicated. But I've found that, just as I said earlier, sort of acknowledging that all of these changes and the losses that we're feeling, or somebody is feeling when they're dealing with, their loved one with dementia, whether it be something as simple as, he can no longer take out the trash for me, right? Or she can no longer, she doesn't remember her favorite dress that she used to wear, or some of the terminology that you might use gets lost. It can really impact that shared experience that people who are connected have together, and just losing that shared experience is a loss in and of itself. Right. So all of those losses compound before the person is gone. Yeah. And so it makes it very ambiguous. You hear people talking a lot about ambiguous loss. It's very unclear. It's not a very clear cut. Somebody is sick, they pass away, and you grieve. It's just much more involved than that. Right. And then you still do have to face eventually the passing of that person, them actually dying, and then grieving that too. So very often it's sort of this multiple staged grief. But I have found with my clients, if they are actively grieving along the way, it does tend to lend itself to that final point in time when the person dies, that they then progress through that grief and move forward without the person much more effectively. Another time that brings about a lot of grief with clients, I don't know if you've found this, but is when someone ends up getting placed in a facility, and especially if the caregiver is no longer able to take on that full-time care. That decision to place somebody, whether it was discussed beforehand or not, that's a very delicate situation. But as we've seen with dementia, it can really change people's personalities. Sometimes they get very aggressive. Not everybody, but sometimes we're dealing with, really, really difficult behaviors, even where police have to get involved. And sometimes people have to be moved into a setting that is, more institutionalized. And that is a very, very difficult decision for families. And it's also another time of tremendous feelings of loss.
I think to piggyback off of that, guilt. Guilt is part of this caregiver grief cycle too, because maybe if we're talking about placement, that tremendous amount of guilt thinking, is it too early or are they going to decline? And I mean, there are many other examples of guilt, but that's definitely one that stood out for me as you're talking about placement. And as we talk about guilt, my type A caregivers, I feel like they always report a lot of this pressure to fix and to do and to help. And I think that stress comes with, feeling guilty for not being able to help or fix their loved one. And through my work, I do a lot of normalizing this experience where you're used to having a problem and being able to fix it and just wearing that hat for your family, being able to always be the one that your kids go to if you're having a tough day or your feelings are hurt, or just being that go-to for your friend. And then you have this disease that you're battling, and through, everything the way that you're built, you just want to fix it. And I think the guilt and, through the grief, the different stages of grief, just letting go of that need or that guilt from not being able to fix this or change this. And I feel like that's been really healing to process through those types of, emotions about wanting to control or fix this.
So what are some of the things that you find effective in helping people move through the grief? You mentioned, processing some of these feelings of needing to fix. I've experienced that as well, and trying to help people maybe reframe or redirect some of those feelings where sometimes when caregivers feel very much like I'm the one that should be doing this job, I'm the one that my loved one wants to be doing this job, trying to help redirect that to maybe where they're no longer performing the hands-on care. Maybe they could be performing the management of something, or finding somewhere to focus that energy. So what are some of the ways you find it helpful for people to, maybe some tools we can give to help people move through some of the grief that they're experiencing in this process?
I think the first thing that kind of pops into mind is just processing that, asking for help, or processing what is keeping them from asking for help. I have a lot of caregivers who are like you were mentioning, I have to do it. It has to be me. My caregiver wants it to, or my loved one wants it to be me. So just processing through that resistance, that need to always be the one in control. And I've actually even given my clients homework and say, I want you to pick one person and I want you to call them and ask them to help. I want you to ask them to come over for a half hour and just take a drive and come back and see how that feels, because they worry so much about their loved one that they don't want them, anything to happen to them, but they're also just in such a routine that they forget to ask for help.
They get mired down,
Yeah.
I think, by that responsibility.
Sure.
And you kind of lose the forest through the trees, right? Of you could step away. And while it sounds very basic for some people that are familiar and comfortable with asking for that help or already have that built into their network, for other people, that's monumental, really and truly, to have someone come over for even a half an hour in order to provide a half an hour of respite.
Yeah.
So that caregiver can step out. Yeah. So that's a great.
Yeah, I think a lot of, some other things that we work on, just the irrational thought patterns that come up. I have a caregiver who would just talk about all of the mistakes that she made throughout the day and how she would focus on those. So kind of taking a step back and like you said, reprogramming her thoughts. And I had her focus on all the positives that she had done for the day and all the things that she was doing that was helpful. And sometimes it's just reframing your thoughts and reminding yourself, hey, my loved one is in good hands. I'm doing the best job I can. Because when we're exhausted and we feel the weight of the world on our shoulders, we have added responsibilities, we tend to really judge ourselves when we make one mistake. And so that's something that I definitely process a lot in my sessions. Just be kind to yourself.
It's easy to feel harshly about ourselves when we lose patience. Yeah. And it's very easy to lose your patience when you're being asked the same question 20 times over the course of an hour. And, we're all human. And so, yes, while we can work on strategies to maybe combat both the challenging behaviors on the part of the person who has dementia, as well as the response of the caregiver, we're human, and we have to give ourselves a little bit of grace to be imperfect in this process, because it's not a perfect scenario. And as we said earlier, this is a marathon, so you're being tasked to do these things over the course of many hours, many days, sometimes many years. And so, just as you said, I like how you said that, just be kind to yourself. Yeah. And sometimes it takes getting out of your own situation a little bit, at least from a mental perspective, which is where I feel like the work that we do is so valuable, because we can help provide that perspective to the caregiver when the caregiver is really stuck in their thought patterns and their day-to-day. It is very helpful for caregivers to have a social network, just connecting with people socially in any capacity, whether it be a phone call, whether it be, having a visitor come to the house, whether it be carving out and, 2 hours out of your week to have somebody come, or if you're fortunate enough to be able to pay for someone to come to go attend a support group, or even get together with friends to play some golf. I know nobody plays golf in 2 hours. It's a much longer process. Right. But, if you can maybe do half a course and do it in 2 hours, or whatever works in your situation, and to not carry guilt about taking the time to do that, because when we socialize, we release, chemicals in our brain, all that dopamine that we need to feel good. And so it really truly is in your own best health to do that. And going and seeking counseling is another wonderful avenue to get some of that feedback to help frame your situation, your individual situation. And I've just had good luck with my caregivers in sharing that.
I think it helps the support groups to help normalize that, because when you're sitting home alone and you're the only one in the room, you're going to be judging yourself. You're going to be thinking, oh, I must be the only person in the world going through this. And it's so enlightening for caregiver. The feedback that they report is how enlightening it is you can just breathe knowing they're not in this alone. And I have a lot of feedback from my caregivers about caregiver support groups about how important it is to just normalize their experience and their emotions. even though everybody's journey looks different, I think it just helps somebody saying, oh, I know what you mean, or even to just, just hold space for them and know, oh, I know what you're going through. I think just that alone can be really powerful for caregivers.
And touching on the grief piece that we've been talking about, but to expound on that a little bit as well and giving people some tools. There are some different types of exercises, and I don't mean physical exercises like push-ups. I mean more so exercises, activities that we can do in order to process some of the grief that people experience along the way with dementia as well. Sometimes we can do something sort of ceremonial to maybe say goodbye to a part of our life that has, forever now been changed. As we sometimes, are looking at the shadow of the person with dementia or the shell of the person with dementia, and that person, the personality that's sort of been stripped from that individual. So they're no longer there. So that person, we're kind of experiencing the death of that person while they're still alive, but it's sort of a shell of them. We can do a lot of different work in counseling to, process that, whether it be, sort of writing a goodbye letter to that person that, or maybe a goodbye letter to what we had hoped for our life with that person. Maybe it's, you had hoped that your father would walk you down the aisle at your wedding, and that's not a reality anymore. Or you'd hoped that they would have been at your child's, first high school football game or something like that. We can sort of say goodbye and go through the grieving process, and doing something active helps bring up those feelings, helps to bring up that processing, so that you do give yourself the opportunity to grieve along the way within the dementia framework of grieving. Sometimes it's, writing on a balloon filled with helium, of course, but a balloon filled with helium, something that you will miss about that person that's no longer readily available to you, and letting that balloon go. So there's similar techniques for when somebody actually passes, but you can do those things along the way so that you have something sort of tangible and something that you can look to actively process and grieve as you're going through the dementia disease process with your loved one.
Yeah, that's powerful stuff. That's good.
We learn by doing, and I've been extremely fortunate to work with a lot of caregivers, as have you, as well as individuals with dementia. So we can use these techniques in either form or format, but they really are effective, and that's where the beauty of counseling comes in. Some people may really truly be experiencing some level of depression, right? Which may necessitate doctor's involvement if some of these other techniques are not effective, but getting a prescription for an antidepressant for a period of time in conjunction with counseling. We know that the two together really are most effective. Right. So just going out and getting put on meds isn't really the best fix typically. But if you can seek out some type of support or counseling, professional counseling, you can work in conjunction to work through this grief.
Yeah. We were talking earlier about socializing, and I think one of the most important things for the caregiver to remember is your friends are necessarily going to sit around and know that you need them to call. So put yourself out there. Don't be afraid to pick up the phone, call your friends, call your neighbor. Just make sure you're really putting yourself out there, because we tend to isolate when we feel overwhelmed and we have all these responsibilities. So it's important to make sure you don't, I think, personalize. Well, they haven't called me, so they must not care about me. We have to really worry about not personalizing other people's behavior. I think I see that a lot where, well, my friends must not want to hang out with me because I've got a lot of stress and they don't want to hear about it. So my advice to caregivers is to just You're not a mind reader. Don't be a mind reader. Just pick up the phone and call them. I think they're your friends. You know them, and you should really trust them and trust that they're there for you. But as Andrea said earlier, when we're in this process, people don't always know how to reach out or what to say. So, don't be afraid to pick up the phone. I think it's important for self-care.
So hopefully we've given a few helpful hints to people. I know you have your practice here.
Yeah. So here at Sage, I know how difficult it is for especially caregivers to get out and take care of themselves and make self-care a priority. So I decided, in addition to being a therapist, I'm also a Reiki practitioner. So I designed a self-care Saturday, which is every second Saturday of the month. And that includes a $15 for a 30-minute Reiki session. And that is for caregivers or individuals diagnosed with a cognitive impairment. It's just a really good way to take time for yourself and to relax. And I'm hoping to be able to benefit the population a little more, give some more resources for you. And you can always visit the Sage website, their website, Facebook, Instagram. You can check us out there, and I will let you know when my classes will be available. And I hope you join me for Self-Care Saturday. Andrea, it's been so awesome having you here.
Yes, thank you so much for having me join you today. It's been a real pleasure. I'm, always passionate about trying to help caregivers. You can see me right now on Psychology Today. If you look up my name, Andrea Lindquist, LCSW, and website will be coming soon, as well as you can reach me through Renee, and on her blog, there'll be a way to get in touch with me as well. So thank you for listening.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in today. And until next time, have a great day.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you for spending some of your time today with us at Sage Holistic Health and Wellness Center. If you like what we're all about, please consider supporting our nonprofit organization by making a tax-deductible donation. To do this, you can go to our website at www.sagewellnessctr.org and click on Donate in the upper right-hand corner. We look forward to spending some time again with you real soon. Take good care.